Thank you for letting me talk about it a little bit. So I want to do three things. There are a lot of things in the book that we won't probably be able to talk about today, but one of the things that I think is interesting and practical is my work on the lifelike sculpture. And
Wait, is the audio on the laptop? Just turn it on.
I think my Zoom audio.
This
It's
one,
this one,
this one is
the
on.
sound is coming.
Okay, so are we good?
Go ahead.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Okay. So the lifelike sculpture as a metaphor for illusion. Where
Well, that's it, since you're okay now.
do you I mean what is do you have any favorite illusions? Like what's an illusion? If I say the word illusion, what comes to mind? Does anybody carry those around in your back pockets?
Illusions, I've got. plenty of them. I've
Illusions.
got adults.
Illusion. To allude to something, right? Is
That's
that-
right. So there are a lot of illusions in our church service. Allusions to you have Peter or Paul or whoever alluding to scriptures and quoting scriptures, and that's what we're talking about here. But Pushkin was concerned in particular with the lifelike sculpture metaphor as a way of conceptualizing his poetic legacy. So what happens to things that we create when we can no longer control them? And that's actually a really relevant topic. I think sometimes in aesthetics, this all seems very dense and very complicated and not particularly relevant. But, the idea that we create things that then take on a life of their own should resonate, at least in a sort of a science fiction-y sort of way with AI. I don't know if chatbot GPT is something that you've been thinking a lot about, but, here humans have created this thing. And now it's sort of speaking back to us in ways that we are a little worried about because
Yes.
we're not sure we can control them. So this idea of poetic legacy, is it really just about ego? It's not just about sort of, am I going to be a great poet or not? In a lot of ways, it's a concern that we all face as we think about what we've created and what it will do that is beyond our control. So the lifelike sculpture here is a metaphor for Pushkin, and a part of my book tries to articulate why and how, and to document this. And this is a contribution that I make to the field of Russian literary studies. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about. Another one is that this monument right here's the very top of it, is something that Pushkin did not want. He specifically said he hated images of himself. This was not something that he envisioned. And yet he wrote a poem called Monument and said, I have built a monument to myself. That was in 1836. He died in 1837. And it wasn't until 1880 that this monument was dedicated. So, quite a long time after his death. And it's a very interesting work of art. On the surface, it seems kind of simple, it's just, Pushkin, it's just him with his curly sideburns, and it's like, well, what's interesting about that? But it does function in an interesting way. And that's also part of what my book does, is it explains the function of this work of art and why it is an interesting work of art and how it continues to function in literature. And that's something that we probably won't have time to get into today. We'll just look at the monument itself. But a lot of my book is about explaining how other people have developed and worked with the unique aesthetic elements of the Pushkin monument in their own ideas in art. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about naive readers, what it means to be a naive reader, and what this has to do with the Pushkin monument. This is one of the elements of my research that was a little bit of a surprise to me. But the idea that this monument in some way from the poem all the way up to, now, that it incorporates the idea, it's a cultural history of how people have thought about what it means to read incompletely, to misread, to read in ways that are wrong. Like today, when Father Glenn was talking about the the idea that people have misinterpreted this, that I am the way to the Father, or whatever. That's an example, right? You take things too literally and then you build them into really problematic sorts of ideologies. And that idea is part and parcel of the history of this monument. And so if there are contributions in my work to the field of Russian studies, these are the big contributions. So we'll see how far we get. I don't know. I've got way too many slides. So. This all starts with a Latin poem called Exegi Monumentum, or I Have Built a Monument. And this is the very last ode in Horace's Book of Odes. He wrote 4 books. This is the last one in book 3, but book 4 came later. Right? So this was sort of the last ode in a book of odes. And Horace was very famous for his odes. This is his big contribution. The Horatian ode is, still a thing. And the idea here is that Horace is playing with this idea of monument as both a statue, but also not a statue, right? Is this visual art or verbal art? Because statues were a thing here at before right here, right in the Roman Empire. And his successor, Ovid, in many ways, took up this poem. And at the end of his book, Metamorphosis, he writes a different version of Horace's Exegi Monumentum. Like he imitates it in a way that makes it his own, but that is also clear that it's an imitation. In other words, this is an allusion, right? Ovid alludes to Horace in writing the very last part of his magnum opus. And so what Ovid does in this book, and I'm going to get into this more specifically, because lifelike monuments, like lifelike statues, dominate this whole work. Ovid's Metamorphosis starts with lifelike statues, and then it ends with this idea of a monument that rises higher than Julius and Augustus Caesar, which, is, of course, a very political statement, right? Poetry is more powerful than emperors. Ovid was in all sorts of trouble for these sorts of things. And so this is an important network of allusions, because Russian poets in the 18th century studied Horace and Ovid. I mean, this was their education. They had a classical education. They studied Latin. They read Horace and Ovid in French. They did translate some of these things into Russian, but not completely. They were mostly reading in Latin and French. And this was also Pushkin's education in the early 19th century. These are the poets that Pushkin was reading, and so he was well versed in their ideas. And these are the most significant allusions. But the thing about this Exegi Monumentum poem is that, like, almost every poet from the 19th century wrote their own version of this. Like, Pushkin isn't unique in writing his own version of Horace's poem, but he does some unique things with it that make it a real cornerstone in Russian literary studies. Like so many people have written about this poem. It's a major poem in the field. So that's the background for Pushkin's poem, and we'll get to Pushkin's poem in a minute. And that's, the name of my book here is Poem, Statue, and Performance, right? So before there was the statue, there was the poem called Monument, and then the sort of the statue came around. And then this whole culture of performance developed around all of these things, both the poem and the statue, and the history of other performances that have taken place around the statue. But okay, so that's all kind of background that we need. Right now, I want to jump into this lifelike statue and how this metaphor works and what Pushkin is drawing on. And we need a fancy word for this. Ekphrasis is the word for the device of describing a visual work of art in words. And this is something that happens in classical literature all over the place. And it often happens with statues. And what you do when you describe a statue is you make it come to life in some way, right? The thing that is, not alive in words suddenly comes to life and does interesting things. And there are a lot of statues that come to life, particularly in Ovid's Metamorphoses. And this is the main metaphor. This is the main metamorphosis, right? The main metamorphosis is that something that is not alive comes to life. And this starts at the very beginning, right? Ovid's Metamorphoses begins with the Titan Prometheus, who molds earth and rainwater into the image of the omnipotent gods. This is the quote from Metamorphosis, right? So this idea that people were somehow created in the image of God is a very old idea, and Ovid is working with that in these as he reworks the Greek myths. So here's already we have humans are a statue, right? And made out of things that aren't real or things that aren't alive, and then somehow they are brought to life. And this happens with stones too, right? Deucalion and Pyrrha toss stones, which are the bones of Mother Earth, behind them, and they begin to take on human form. And you can see that, we're talking about statues, like specifically, we're talking about statues that look like people that come to life. And so, like today in Peter, right, that idea of living stones. This is a really common metaphor that shows up in lots of places and not just, in Pushkin's poem. But he does interesting things with this metaphor. Now, but what happens is that there's a progression, right? So we have earth and rainwater, and then we have stones. And then, as we progress through Metamorphosis, Pygmalion creates this ivory, which is bone, but it's not like stones are, like bone is actually from a living being, right? It's ivory that he creates an ivory statue, and then it's brought to life by Venus. Right? And so you see a progression, not just in the materials, but also in the aesthetic conceptualization. Like this is a beautiful statue, not a roughed out statue, not some sort of mud thing, And then finally, we get to the end of Metamorphosis, and Julius and Augustus Caesar become stars, and their monuments are reminders of their deification. And here, deification the emperor seems like this very pagan notion, but this also underlies the Christian notion of theosis or deification, where, as like today we were talking about spiritual milk and growing and all of that stuff, we become more and more like God. This actually is related to the sculptural metaphor of lifelike statues, and it's rooted in, like, for example, the Cappadocians, the Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory Nazianzus. They called it the sculptural metaphor, and they used that word, and they talked about metamorphosis and theosis using the pagan philosophical articulation of the lifelike statue as a justification for what happens in the incarnation, right? That when and that leads us to the next side of the lifelike statue. So we have this ekphrastic side where things come to life through words. And then, of course, Ovid's claim here, when he imitates Horace at the end of all of this, his metamorphosis is higher still, right? Higher beyond the stars, higher than the Caesars. But there's another side of the lifelike statue in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and that is, like, if you're looking at a lifelike statue, how do you can think of it as something that was made and through skill and craftsmanship is so realistic that it looks like it could come to life, right? But you could also conceptualize a lifelike statue as sort of a scary thing, right? Something that actually was alive and, has ceased now to be alive. And that happens a lot in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So these then become images of their own narrative, right? So there's a whole story behind this person and their relationship to the gods, and then somehow the gods curse them and they get turned to marble or stone or something else. So one of these examples is that Niobe is turned to a marble statue of herself that weeps eternally. She is a reminder of the terror of divine wrath incurred when humans push the gods too far. And so here's where this memorial is actually given this sort of threatening moment. And Mercury turns Aglaros into a statue that is darkened by her envy, right? So Juno kills Ino, the human Ino, and then turns Ino's mourning servants into a memorial of her cruelty. I think the quote is her cruelty's greatest memorial, right? So there's an idea here that the gods are also capable of art, right? They can turn you into a work of art. And maybe this is something that you don't really want to be, And one of the ones that I find the most interesting for the metaphor for lifelike sculpture as a metaphor of illusion is Echo. Echo is also a lifelike sort of sculpture, but her lifelikeness isn't so much that she looks like a human in stone form or marble form, but she's cursed by Juno and wastes away until her bones become stones that can do nothing but repeat what someone else says. And this is actually, like here, this isn't just about sort of, echo, right? This is a poet who's writing about the idea that when other people use his words, they actually lose their meaning. They actually sort of fade away into nothingness and become, it's an anxiety of a poet who's writing their words and maybe hoping that someone uses them in an interesting way and sort of brings them to life, but recognizing that sometimes poets are reduced to quotes that actually degrade their original meaning. So I really like this particular story in Metamorphoses with relationship to this project. Okay, so I don't know if we should stop here and kind of think about this, but the lifelike statue, I've hoped to show that it's ambivalent. It's not just a miracle. Of course, it's the miracle of life, right? I mean, you think about babies and you see their first breath, right? These little plastic dolls all of a sudden, like there's this miracle of the breath of life. It's something that takes on its own volition and will and starts to grow. And then, of course, today I couldn't help but think about Stephen, right? And this idea of stoning, where, I think that story is also interesting in the sense of pre-modern magical thought, right? What if you throw stone, like why do we throw rice or birdseed at weddings? And this is a fertility ritual, right? The fertility of the seed is transferred to the fertility of the newly married couple. Well, the same sort of logic is going on here, right? We are living sculptures. We are living stones. And when, you want to reduce someone, you throw the thing at them that you want them to become like. There's a stoning here sort of also operates on the same logic of this idea that somehow we are living sculptures. So anyway, I got a little distracted there, but that's the idea of behind Pushkin's interest in the sculpture metaphor. And when he wrote this poem in August of 1830, he died in January of 1930 or 1837. So this is like 6 months before his death. And he knew, but he wasn't he was born 1799. Oh. He's 37 years old. He's not an old person now that I'm 40. Now that I'm 44. But he knew that his time was short. He died in a duel, right? So but then also in the duel, there's this moment that he kind of maybe there were reasons, but you know, romantic poets end bad. They never really, you can't sustain that sort of romantic life for very long. So he was thinking about his death, he was thinking about his legacy, and he was thinking about becoming this, right? Thinking about becoming a reduction, thinking about becoming a name. Of course, he wanted to be a great poet, and he is a great poet, but so I want to now transition a little bit to the poem and thinking about what it is that he wrote. And the epigraph is the title of Horace's ode, right? Exegi Monumentum. And right from that Latin, he moves into his own version of this, which in many ways imitates Horace, but changes it in ways that here, if we think about Horace's monument, is this poem alive? And when is Horace's poem really alive? Well, it's not alive when we refer to, we haven't even read, you don't know what's in Horace's poem. Yeah? Like it's just this dead thing that you know about. It's reduced to its title. You don't understand its aesthetic function. You don't really know what's going on in it until Pushkin comes, or Ovid, right, comes along, and they bring in a new life, something that Horace couldn't have foreseen, but that they couldn't do without Horace. It's a collaboration, right? This allusion here is this kind of reading that finds new aesthetic insight in the work of art. So we're alluding to Horace, but also to all of the other people, right? And there were, you know, Lomonosov, Tirjavin, a lot of the poets who preceded Pushkin wrote their own version, and Pushkin's version in some ways also is a nod to them. So he's bringing these other poets to life, even as he is looking at his death. And I think he's hoping that somebody will do this for him, right? There's this idea that you know, in poetic legacy, that it's not all this sort of now I'm a great poet. There's also a descent into an image of what one really is, where the image is actually a reduction in form, right? Poetry is higher than the emperors, who are stars, right? Like there's, so he starts it off by like this: I have raised to myself a monument not made by hands. The people's path to it will not become overgrown. It raises its unsubmissive head higher than the Alexandrian pillar. And I'm sure that you're so excited about these words that you can hardly contain. You're like, wow, he really is a great poet. Well, it's really cool poetry, but like there are so many allusions here to monuments and statues that you have to like stop and unpack it, because sure, he's not talking about this, right? He doesn't know this exists, and he honestly really doesn't. He thought he was a very ugly person. He didn't want somebody to remember his face, and he wrote about this. So you know, here he's talking about his works, and he calls them not made by hands. Well, this is one of those things that's a Pushkinian innovation, right? This is something new. Other poets who are imitating Horace have not used this word. And what's interesting about it is that it's an allusion to like a lot of things. It's not just an allusion to one thing. And so I wanted to unpack this a little bit for you to kind of see how Pushkin's art is working in the poem. So we've already established that ekphrasis is the verbal description of a work of visual art. And by using this word not made by hands, Pushkin is actually referring to the ekphrasis of this monument that was written by a previous poet. Right? So this not made by hands is a reference to somebody else's verbal description of the Bronze Horseman in St. Petersburg, which was dedicated in 1782. This is the first major work of visual three-dimensional art in Russia. So, you know, three-dimensional art is taboo. Why?
Because it's recreating God's job.
Idols. Yeah, it's idolatry. right? So before, before 1782, three-dimensional works of art were taboo. It was idolatry, like icons, right? The spiritual image are two-dimensional. They're the dimensions are skewed, right? If you go over those plates, or do we have other icons in here? Like this idea that it's not supposed to be a physical representation because it's a representation of a spiritual reality, and there's a commandment against idolatry. Yeah. So, this is interesting that this is just before Pushkin's birth. Sculpture is a relatively new thing. And it's also interesting to note that this Russian sculpture has the dedication, to Peter the First from Catherine II in Latin. Latin is the language of the heretic, right? I mean, this is a Russian Orthodox country where, Cyrillic is the language of the true Christian church. And the Pope, is a heresy. This is the papal fallacy is a major thing. So, this idea that somehow Latin would show up here is actually, there's a whole story behind that. But anyway, I could get real distracted here. I think what I was trying to say, not made by hands. So Rubens, this poet from the, 1785, wrote this great description of the very first sculpture to Peter the Great, and the first really, major sculpture in Russian public spaces ever. And so part of this also refers to this stone, which is actually this is a monolith, the piece of Finnish granite that was brought over a course of years by hand, like rolling this thing over logs all the way from Karelia in what we think of today as sort of, Finnish, or close to Finland there. And so, I mean, this was a major feat, getting this piece of rock into this place in St. Petersburg, because St. Petersburg was a swamp. Like, how do you get, how many tons of stone do you get over a swamp? So anyway, that's part of the reference. But there's more going on here. Pushkin writes his own poem about the Bronze Horseman, and he calls it the Bronze Horseman in 1833. And so this not made by hands is a reference to another poet's ekphrasis of the monument to Peter the Great. But the reason that this is called the Bronze Horseman and not the monument to Peter the Great is Pushkin's poem, right? It's not called the Bronze Horseman. It was called the Monument to Peter the Great until Pushkin wrote his poem. And then people couldn't think of it in any other way, right? So, and what happens in Pushkin's poem is that Peter the Great comes to life and chases the hero of the poem around St. Petersburg, but, in this really terrifying sort of way. So Peter the Great jumps off of that big stone, and you can hear the metallic thud of the hooves as poor, Yevgeny is trying to get away from this awful monument. And so, here again, it's like, this isn't necessarily the most complimentary vision of Peter's legacy. And, you think about Ovid being higher than Caesar and Augustus, and Pushkin's making his own commentary here about autocracy in Russia and its effects on the poor people like Yevgeny, who have to live in the space that they created. So he's also alluding to his own work, right? Because he's building in all of these complex allusions to the first monument in Russia. But of course, this idea that that something is not made by hands, this nerukotvorny is the Russian word, and it's a very specific. It's not like in English; it looks like several words, right? Not made by hands. In Russian, this is one adjective, nerukotvorny, and it refers to an icon that, of course, predates the Thunder Rock, or that big piece of Finnish granite. It refers to this icon. And this is one from Novgorod in the 12th century. But the idea that the image of Jesus in this icon is not made by hands is the idea that he was handed a towel. I think that Veronica handed him a towel on the way to crucifixion, and he wiped his face with it, and that the image of his face was like miraculously recorded on this towel.
Is
So,
that like the Shroud of Turin?
well, yeah, they're related. Related legends or myths or ideas, stories about, well, how do we know what Jesus looked like, or what is the justification for icons if we don't even know what he looked like? There's all these sorts of ideas. Well, what did Jesus look like? And it's a very old story that predates, of course, the 12th century, but this is a 12th century version of it. So that, and this is where I think this is really interesting, because remember, in the lifelike statue, you had this sort of ekphrastic moment. It was miraculous. Things were coming to life that used to not be alive. But there's also this other version, which I called iconism, right? Where something is reduced to an image of itself that is actually much less. I mean, think about a picture of yourself when you were a child. Is that you? Well, yes, but not, I mean, it's only this like small part of you. It's a reduction. You're much more complex. And yet, a picture of you from today is also less complex than what you really are. So this idea of an image as a reduction in complexity is actually really important. And I think the word icon actually really works here, because underlying the theological justification for icons is not just this idea that, well, actually we know what Jesus looked like, but it's the theology of the incarnation. That if we don't see what Jesus looked like, then we don't really believe that he was a person. Because if he was really a person, you could have seen him. Like, this is the theological justification for icons. And I think it really works with the incarnation, right? The idea that somehow Jesus was God, and yet, equality with God was not something that he wanted to grasp, but he made himself nothing, and he reduced himself. He became less than what he was. So, right here in this one illusion, this ambivalence of the lifelike statue is at play. That on one hand, Pushkin is becoming less than what he is, what he wants to be. His poetry is being reduced in form, because now there's nothing like, who's going to pick it up? He doesn't know. But at the same time, he's sort of building this idea that it could be brought to life into his idea about his legacy. All right, now there's another allusion in this first stanza. We're still going back to this first stanza of the poem, right? Where he calls it the Alexandrian pillar, and he's referring to a specific thing. But actually, like, what he's referring to is this huge debate, and I'm not going to go into it, because then you would definitely sleep. But this is probably, I mean, this at least is one of the more productive ideas, that when he says Alexandrian pillar, he's referring to the Alexander column in St. Petersburg. And this is the Alexander column. It's sort of a pedestal with a piece of granite that is a column, and it's actually freestanding. Like, that's not anchored in any way. It's just like sat. It's just sitting up there. And then on top of that, there is an angel holding a cross. And you can't really see it from this particular, you can kind of see a little bit of it, but there's also a snake. Did you see the snake in the other one?
Peter.
Yeah, there's that big snake, right? I'm going the wrong way. Yeah. Right. This is the poem again. So we talked about this illusion. Now we're talking about this one. Here, the snake is, the horse is trampling a snake. Yeah. So actually, when you get to Alexander's column, it's 1834. This is like the second major work of monumental art in Russian history, and it is an illusion. Where do you think that piece of marble comes from? This the same quarry. It's Finnish granite, right? It comes from the same quarry that the Thunderstone came from in the monument to Peter the Great. So, and it's an illusion. But you remember, like that the thing that Peter's jumping off of is this, like, sort of, it looks like a cliff or whatever. It's not really. It's a roughed out sort of image, where this is like a polished granite column, and the illusion here is that Russia is being refined, because of course now Russia has saved Europe from itself for the first time, according to Russia, because this is a memorial to Alexander the First's victory over Napoleon, and that's a major. Russia has entered the European stage in a new way, and this is a monument to Alexander the Great and his victory over Napoleon. And it's actually higher than the Vendôme column in Paris, which was, the column that celebrated Napoleon's victory. Like it's like who has the biggest column or whatever. But so like that, it's an allusion to other things. It's an allusion to Peter the Great, an allusion to Napoleon's column. And now I also should say that the sculpture of this angel, this is an angel, but the sculpture of the angel was actually created from Alexander the First's death mask. The death mask was the 19th century way of, well, not even 19th century, because Peter the Great's sculpture is made from his death mask. Like the face of these sculptures is made from a plaster cast of these emperors' faces that was made just after their death. Like this is the first thing they do. They stop breathing, plaster on. So, and this, of course, is what? This is Pushkin's death mask. So, this practice of sculpture is actually captures this life, like you turn the stone and we make a cast of that. It's an interesting idea. But now here I want to talk about something else that plays into this idea of the lifelike sculpture. So illusion is a collaborative practice. I mean, a lot of times I think this is taught as something that poets do. Like poets refer to other poets, or writers allude to other writers. But there are two sides to illusion, and that is the illusion has to be recognized. It has to be conceptualized. It has to be, brought to life, right, by the reader, or otherwise it doesn't exist. It's just as if it doesn't exist. We read that.
That's why people can't read Shakespeare anymore, because they don't understand any of the allusions. Right?
And this is where we're getting to the naive reader, right? Exactly, right? That illusion also becomes sort of an index of cultural literacy, right? You read something, how much can you recognize the meaning if you don't understand the references? So it takes two, right? The poet has to work on this, but then the poet also has to wonder, how will my future readers know? And this was becoming more and more acute in Pushkin's time, because up to Pushkin's time, who did poets write for? They wrote for emperors. They wrote for the class of the nobility. They wrote for a group of people that was so small that they literally knew them, right? Their audience was a class of people that was just like them, and that they knew, or if they didn't know personally, they knew, the family. But by the time Pushkin was writing, there was a larger group. There was an anonymous readership, right? There was an idea that I'm writing for people that I don't know. And it was still a very small group of people, but it was larger, and it was already sort of clear that literacy would continue to grow. And it did throughout the 19th century. And so this idea that illusion is not just me bringing poets to life, it's also somehow what people will do to me in the future is really important. And one of the ways that lifelike sculptures work is that the viewer has to interact with them. So, it looks like Peter was jumping off of that cliff. But guess what? If you walk around it in the right way, it looks like Peter's like moving, right? If you're looking at the sculpture and you walk up to it, it looks like so like when it jumps off the cliff and chases Yevgeny around, St. Petersburg, like this is an experience one could have if you walk up to it and then all of a sudden you're like right underneath the hooves. Like it requires imagination, but it also requires movement through space. And the same is true of this statue. If you really look at it and you walk around it in the right way, it looks like the hand on the angel is doing this. Like it's pointing up to the cross. Like it moves in relation. The spaces between the hand and the cross change as you move. And it looks like the statue is moving. So you are the one that has to bring it to life. And this is the sort of the verbal and the visual elusive practice that Pushkin is engaging in. And, just kind of to bring it back, this is my claim in my book. So, I don't know, you can decide if it's convincing or not, but, this is sort of one of what my book is supposed to do anyway. Okay, where are we at? How are we doing? I said we were going to end at 12:15, so it's 12:11. I kind of came back to this stanza because now you can see at least a couple of the complex allusions that are going on here, and how they relate to the lifelike statue. The idea that this is also a metaphor for what Pushkin is hoping will happen. Okay, so another big part of my book is to outline the history of the creation of the monument and to go through how, as people were trying to visualize Pushkin and his works after his death, there were all sorts of complexities. And I'm going to skip over a lot of this. I'll show you the pictures, we'll reduce it to the image. These were some of the proposed monuments, and this was a huge debate in Russian literature. Like you probably heard of Anna Karenina if you haven't read it, but Leo Tolstoy refers to this. This is just a proposal, but he refers to it, and they discuss it at the ballet in Anna Karenina. And so it's like this idea of creating a monument to Pushkin was huge, because this is the third major monument. The third major sculpture that was meant for public consumption. I mean, it was a big deal, but it was also a first, because Peter the Great and Alexander the First were both emperors. Pushkin was not. Pushkin was a poet. He was exiled once. He was censored many times. He faced exile more than once. So this was a big deal, and why is a whole nother discussion. But I'll just mention that part of the debate included this idea of the future reader, because when Pushkin died, literacy rates were low. In 1861, when they started thinking about what sort of monument they might build, literacy rates were still low, but they were growing. 1861 is when the serfs were emancipated. And so this is a major date because, with this idea, it's like all of a sudden, the serfs need to read Pushkin, right? They need to learn to read. And how are we going to accomplish this? And then in 1880, when the monument was actually dedicated, literacy rates had grown still more. Okay. Now, I want to get to the last part of my the title here, right? Performance. Because what happens when the Pushkin monument is dedicated is that many people give historically important performances, but Dostoevsky gives the one that everybody knows about. And he, in many ways, does the work of the future poet. He brings Pushkin and Pushkin's work to life in a way that, really changes a lot of things in Russian culture. And one of the things that I argue in my book is that this performance is the first in what become a long history of performances in this aesthetic space that actually bring to life not only the statue, but Pushkin's work. They make them interact. And the performance, the poem, and the statue all work in this way of sort of increasing the complexity of meaning in the space of the monument. All right. So I'll just end with, here it is. I'll just end with a few images that sort of try. This is that second moment that I was talking about. I'm going to talk about the lifelike sculpture as a metaphor, and then we're going to see this as a unique work of art. And then we're going to talk about naive readers. So this is the monument, and there are a lot of important moments here. Of course, you have the face and the posture, and many people, like when they look at this, people who aren't naive viewers, right? People who don't just look at it and think, oh, that's what Pushkin looked like. They find references to his poetry. They look at this and they think of the poems that like when Pushkin was out wandering around the city, like he has these poems where he wanders around the city, and they quote them. So that the statue and the poetry work together, but you have to know poetry. You can't just walk up to this monument and then bring your volume of Pushkin and be like you have to know it, and then the monument comes to life. So his sideburns there, I always like to bring them up because they're really impressive. I don't know, like they come like way down here. They're very cool. The hat, which you can't see, but he's holding his hat behind him. All of these things, the toe that kind of breaks the wall of the statue. These are the things that you can kind of make the monument move. Now the pedestal is actually really important because guess what's on the pedestal? The monument poem, right? And there's this like the monument. Is it the poem or is it the statue? Because it's poem that's called monument, but here we actually have a monument, and that's part of what goes on with the aesthetic dynamic here of the statue. Now, the picture that I showed you is what the Pushkin monument looks like today. But it didn't always stand where it stands today. If you go to Moscow, which none of us go, because visa restrictions, but if you went, it would not look like this. But this is what it looked like in 1880. Pushkin here. Now you can see the hat. Pushkin was looking at and sort of respectfully contemplating the Strasnoy monastery or the Passion convent. In Russian, they don't distinguish between convents and monasteries, but this was a place where female monastics lived in central Moscow. It's one of the oldest and most treasured monastic communities in Moscow. And, this idea that Pushkin has taken his hat off and is contemplating the monastery is actually this space in which the person who took this image was emphasizing this gaze, right? That this is where Pushkin seems to be looking. There are all sorts of interpretations of this that we could get into. But then there's also the question, because you see these people sort of milling around. Pushkin is nice and fenced off, but who is reading Pushkin? Right? And here's where this idea of the naive reader comes in, is that people walk around this, and it doesn't emphasize his poetic legacy. It emphasizes his reduction in meaning. He's just part of the landscape. In order to really make this statue come to life, you have to engage with the poetry. And then, of course, there's also the question of, well, what is Pushkin reading? Because, we know that he was reading Horace and Ovid and all of the other Russian poets that he alludes to in his poem, but what's he reading now? That's another moment that comes up in future images. So this is an image from 1932. And here, the question of what Pushkin is reading becomes even more important, right? So the photographer has told us Pushkin is reading Pravda, which is the Bolshevik revolutionary newspaper that began in 1912 and is being celebrated after the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. So 1932 is 20 years of the revolutionary newspaper, Pravda. And we see our leaders of the revolution here on front. This is no longer an operating monastic community, right? The cross has been taken off, and The other interesting thing is that you see Izvestia, which is the other major news source. And I always like this picture because there's a Russian joke. Izvestia means news and Pravda means truth. So the old Soviet joke is there's no news in the truth and there's no truth in the news, you know. But anyway, that's what Pushkin is reading, right? He needs to be updated. He's the imperialist nobleman, right? Who owned serfs. And so, you know, now in the revolution, like he needs to learn. Pushkin needs to learn. But this is also a way of bringing Pushkin to life, right? Pushkin is doing something here. He's not contemplating death and mortality and you know, all of the humility that goes along with monasticism. He's wising up. Now, a few years later, 5 years later, 1937, this is the 20-year revolution of the 20-year anniversary of the revolution. And this was a major, major deal because it's also the 100th anniversary of Pushkin's death. He died in 1837. It's now 1937. And so it's also really ironic because more Russian poets died in 1937 than in like many, many other. Like if you were a Russian poet in 1937, you know, it was a real occupational hazard. So here we're celebrating Pushkin's death while, you know, the other really fascinating thing about this performance is you see how clearly we're focused in on this stanza of the poem. This is new. I mean, this is one of the reasons that because when they built the poem, they didn't know that they were using a censored version of the poem. So the Soviets knew this. And so they changed it because, of course, they're against censorship. And, you know, I hope you see the irony. I don't know. You know, so this is really putting in focus here. And now, you know, we wonder, well, where's the statue? Well, the statue, this is a big poster of Pushkin, who's reading Pushkin, right? So there are a lot of jokes about this, too. It's a really famous picture. This is the front cover of a major architectural journal. And a really famous image. But you see the Izvestia building is still there, but now Pushkin's not reading Pravda, he's reading, Pushkin's reading Pushkin. And then there are jokes about Stalin reading Pushkin and Stalin reading Stalin, which, you know, it's like, well, what's going to happen there, you know? Anyway, but in between is this performance. So here we've got the poem, the statue, and the performance, but they're being rearranged in all sorts of combinations that, you know, are meaningful. And, you know, again, like I could spend a lot of time there. But what happens after 1937 is that they say, look, we got to get rid of this monastery. This is just a vestige of an oppressive imperial colonialist past. We aren't these things anymore. Got to get rid of this. So they tear it down. But then they don't know what to put there. Right? So what do you put? What do you put where the monastery used to be? This is, you can see the Izvestia building is here. And this is where that bell tower used to be, the one that had Pravda on it, and then the poster of Pushkin. And what's really interesting is this is a monument to Prometheus. Remember we started with Prometheus? So why a monument to Prometheus? Well, Prometheus was the Titan who rebelled against the gods. So what do we replace with a monastery? We replace it with a hero who rebelled against the gods. He gave humans fire, right? So this is actually a really interesting allusion that this placeholder actually alludes to the thing that it replaces, but also to the sort of the sculptural myth. You know, Prometheus is also the person or the Titan that molded humans from earth and rainwater. So really fascinating use of elusive space. I mean, I'm against sort of militant atheism. I think it was really violent and awful, but you know, they knew how to use illusions.
But I bet you nowadays people don't know.
Well, it's not there anymore.
Oh, that's gone now.
It's gone.
It's also gone. So they're even better at getting rid of monuments than we are.
Well, this is a really volatile space because, you know, yeah. So, but guess what's here now?
Pushkin?
Pushkin. They moved him. And now Pushkin stands where that person stood. And this is an image, this is a contemporary image from 2017. I was finishing up my book and I was reading a news article about a new biography of Pushkin, who is the sculptor that created this sculpture. He's also a major figure. Like there was this whole competition for like 20 years, and Pushkin is the one that finally won. And so he's a major figure in Russian art. But the title of this article about this new biography was Playing with Pushkin, and there's this image that goes with it, and I was like, this is exactly what I'm talking about, because here it looks like Pushkin is coming to life, right? I mean, it looks like he's like, distracted by this image over to the left. And of course, there are all sorts of poems that one could think about. I mean, Pushkin wrote a lot of them. I won't go into all of them here because, I'm not emphasizing some of the other parts of the lifelike statue. I have alluded to them a little bit, but there's a whole other side to what's going on with the idea of lifelike statues. Yeah,
Is that a contemporary advertisement?
it's a good question, isn't it?
Or is that a montage, or what is that?
Or a building cover while they're working on it.
Yeah, you're all right. But, so in the contemporary moment, now that Pushkin is over on the other side, right? Like it's built into the Russian psyche that we should know what Pushkin is looking at. That's part of interacting with this space. People know this. And there are all sorts of ways to make this funny or problematic. And one of them, of course, is that Pushkin is now, or was before the invasion of 2023, was looking at McDonald's, right? So there are all sorts of jokes to make about Pushkin looking at McDonald's. But this is a good one. Yeah, so there's a large building there now, and they were redoing the facade, but you cover up the scaffolding with advertisements. And then also the pigeon on his head is a major. Like this is where you really get the humility side of this. Like Pushkin has lowered himself from beyond the high stars, right, to being shat upon by the pigeons. Like, there are a lot of jokes about that too, and it's usually stained, right, with white stains. I mean, so it's a great perch. Nothing can get you up there. So. We can talk about how the
So there
statue.
actually hasn't been any desire to take Pushkin down altogether. They've moved him around and they made him look at different things, but they haven't said he represents a past that we want to forget.
Well, a lot of other people are saying this. So, like within the war, like Pushkin is seen as an imperial sort of. I mean, Pushkin is the center of the Russian canon. So, any sort of decentralizing the canon, decolonizing the canon. I mean, there are so many monuments to Pushkin everywhere, like places he'd never been, and so they call it the Pushkin pod, where pod in Slavic is the root for the fall, right? So the fall of Pushkin. So, I mean, this is an element of, and we skipped it because we're almost at 12:30 now, but there's a real colonialist imperial moment in this poem, where he talks about the four corners of the empire. And, in some ways, of course, it's Pushkin, so it's really aesthetically interesting. In other ways, it also reflects a real problematic mentality of Russian.
Well, even
superiority.
now, when in fact, Putin is trying to recreate the empire.
Mhm.
So it's
Yeah.
not now seen as like, well, that was that empire, but this is the new empire, and therefore Pushkin can stand for the new one as well as for the old one.
No, the cult of Pushkin is deeply entrenched. So this all depends on who you're talking about. Like Pushkinapad is happening where? Ukraine. No, and in Russia, of course, it depends on who you talk to. Like just like here, you have people who lament the fall of the canon. Maybe we have some of those in this room. But this is a cultural debate.
So Pushkin, that's in Moscow.
This is in Moscow.
Our son spent several weeks in St. Petersburg when he was a senior in college.
Yeah.
But they were going to go to Moscow, but they had blocked it off because Boris Yeltsin had just died. So he didn't get a chance to go to Moscow. So.
Well,
Where did they put him in the meantime? Like he's been moving around.
so it's just across the street. So
Oh,
yeah, so
okay.
they put him up on this side of the street, and then because the monastery was here, and then in 1937 they tore down the monastery and they put up. There were several placeholders. Prometheus was just one, And then it was empty for a while. And then 1950, there was this whole project where they literally uprooted the pedestal and the statue and everything and rolled it across the street and turned it around. Now he faces the opposite direction. And then there's this whole movement to move him back across the street because they want to rebuild Strasnoy Monastery. And actually,
Yeah, I read about that.
this is also a major metro station. So you can go to a metro station called Pushkin. So you can go under as you go underground to get to the metro, you can actually pass this new sort of excavation where they have excavated the foundations of that bell tower. And you can see the foundations of the bell tower, and they have the whole sort of informational component here. And this is where the naive readers come, because how do you think that, Muscovites who've grown up since 1937, which is, at this point, most people don't, they don't know. Like, they just go to the metro. They don't know that there used to be, now many of them do, because there are all these posters. But the naivete here of both of the architectural space and like, what do we really know about Pushkin? How do we really read his poetry? All this is built into the performances and the poetry itself, right? Pushkin was thinking about this. The future readers and future poets are a major part of his poem.
Yeah, they've been rebuilding a lot of those cathedrals that were destroyed during the revolution, haven't they? Yeah,
Yeah, it's
not just there.
No, it's a thing.
They're
So
doing a lot because the Russian Orthodox Church has become more active, right? Since the fall
yeah,
of
this is a different
of-
talk.
So no, I'm just curious because when do they think that monastery will be done? Because I was reading about it, but I didn't see anything about when it might be done.
Well, they want to, but I don't. As far as I know, it hasn't been commissioned yet. Others have, but
Another Pushkin question, and that is the pedestal. What was the selection that they used of the poetry? You said it was
Yeah.
updated by the, under the Soviets, but what
Yeah.
was the choice for that? Because that was
there are two stanzas. Let's see. I think I have them here. They put one stanza on one side and one on another, and it's a 5-stanza poem. This one is, rumor of me. I'll find the English translation because it's hard to follow if you can't read it. This is the second one. Here you see the future poet, right? He's saying, I won't die. I will come back to life as long as there's one poet. But then he also has all these naive readers, right? Who are more interested in rumor, right? They won't know his poetry. What will they know? His name, right? These naive readers. It's like, oh yeah, all these peoples of the empire. This is one that's on the poem, that's on the monument. Why? Because it celebrates the empire. Pushkin is the poet of the empire, right? Of the peoples.
Yeah.
And these are actually really sort of condescending ways. The grandson of the Slavs is a reference to the Poles. And there's this whole long relationship between Pushkin and Mickiewicz, who was, of course, his Polish contemporary. And, Pushkin, he missed a lot. He just didn't get it. He didn't get why empire was problematic.
Why would he? I mean, if you live in a thing, you don't know it's problematic.
Well, he knew there were a lot of problematic things. I mean, he knew autocracy was problematic. Like, I think we can know. Which is where this research is going for me now, and that's epistemology, right? And the study of how we know what we know, why we know what we know, but also the limits of human knowledge. Like, there are limits, of course, to what we can know about in the future. But there were Pushkin's contemporaries that saw the empire as problematic. Okay, and this is the one on the other side. Sorry,
I've got some very lucky students.
oh, thank you.
You do.
Which means it's time to end. The compliment. It's like,
Compliment.
it's past 12:30. The restaurants are filling up.
Shut up.
On the exam.
How much?
How many points? Next credit.
It's a question. How naive do you want to be? But this is one too, and this is considered reference to some of Pushkin's contemporaries that were.
So which
martyred.
one you said that the original verse, or one of them that had been put on there, had been redacted, and so they changed it back to the original, or is that what I may have totally misunderstood.
Yeah, no, you didn't miss it. You're really right. There's so much to that story that we don't have time.
Oh, okay.
But the Cliff Notes version is that they built the monument, they put up a censored version of the poem, not knowing that it was a censored version of the poem.
Oh, okay.
And then at the dedication in 1880, somebody realized that this is a censored version of the poem.
Oops.
And then the Soviets, like that was 1880, so 1937, the Soviets are like, freedom of speech. We are against censorship. They changed it. They can't censor Pushkin. So that's the Cliff Notes version. Yeah.
Do you think it's part of the human nature, poet or not, to seek memorialization in some way?
Yeah, memory, I think, is, and I think especially in writing, right, that these words are somehow things that go on. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it's why I want to be buried in a pine coffin and not in a metal box,
We have composting for human remains in New York.
That I have already I've sent the article to Dina.
We're actually talking about.
Yeah, like I'd rather become a tree than a metal thing.
Yeah.
All right, well,
Sidney, thank you
thank
so
you,
much.
please, yeah.